I've been wanting to do a desert scene for years, and as soon as I saw these mini spacemen from the Massive Voodoo Challenge, I thought this was my chance to try them out with some crackle paste. This stuff cracks to produce amazing, deep cracks. The theme of this is desolate desert. Watch along and see if you think I achieved it. There are not many ingredients to this diorama. It's mostly based around a breadboard. And to make that look nice and smart, I sprayed it with a black automotive primer. And then I sealed the section I'm going to put the desert onto with just normal PVA craft glue. I'm doing this for two reasons. One, I once used a breadboard and it warped really badly because I hadn't sealed it properly. Two, I'm told that the crackle paste I'm going to use to make my desert works best over a PVA glue layer. I discarded my piece of rosemary bush, it just looked too big, and came up with this. I've no idea what it is, it was in a box and a couple of the branches are broken off. So I tried my vulture in place, thought about it a bit and decided to add a bit of just matte Mod Podge around the outside to see if that would strengthen it. I think this was some kind of herbaceous plant. It just isn't that strong, but it'll be fine for the vulture and for here, and it's got the right shape, and that's the important thing. A lot of modelling is watching stuff dry. This was no exception. When the Mod Podge was dry, I got a cocktail stick and I shoved it in the soft base and then trimmed it to length before drilling a hole in my breadboard and mounting it. I didn't even glue it in place because it was so firmly held, and it enables me to twist it, and the crackle paste we're about to put on will hold it down. Now, I've never used this crackle paste before, but in my mind, I wanted huge cracks. Fast cracks that my poor mini spaceman just couldn't get across. So I troweled this on. I've heard it's really good, this brand, Golden Crackle Paste, and I found it in my cupboard. I must have had a whole deal of buying loads of golden pots because there's a huge amount of them in my cupboard. I don't even remember buying them. So I smoothed it out and put it on one side, and a day or two later, the magic had happened. It says to allow 3 days, and I found probably for the next 4 or 5 days after I put it on, it continued to shrink and the cracks got bigger and bigger, which was perfect for me. So if it still feels cool and damp to the touch, leave it longer, because when it's fully dry, it will be a lot more shrunk than it is maybe a couple of days later. Overall, it came out just as I wanted it. And this, you can see it's quite thick. It's slightly finer cracks towards the edges, which were thinner, and some really nice big chunky cracks in the centre. So perfect. For a first time, and I wasn't sure how this was going to come out, I am really pleased with it. I was heavily channeling Mars when I came up with the paint scheme for this, so I chose a nice rich burnt sienna and I diluted it a lot so it was more like a stain. And this was mostly so I can get it down the cracks and I wouldn't leave any brush marks. I found I needed a smaller brush to get down those cracks, and I just covered everything that was white and made it bright reddy orange. But one coat was just not enough, so I thickened up the mix so it still wasn't going to leave brush marks, but it would give more density of pigment, and I did exactly the same again. To add a bit of variety, I dry brushed the surface, and I did this using the burnt sienna and some pale umber. I just mixed the two together on an old train ticket till I came up with a nice, not too pale colour. I didn't want it to be drastic, and I just went over the top and I built up layers and layers of colour until I had something that was nice and rich and deep. To avoid colouring my black edge too much, I used to use kitchen roll as a bit of a mask. I do have to come back and repaint the black at the end. However, those huge cracks, perfect as they are, have a problem. Even though I'd put loads of paint down the bottom, they're a little bit shiny and perhaps a little bit dark. So I used dilute matte Mod Podge and put that down there in the hope of making it less shiny and more dark. Well, it's darker. So then I tried brown wash. It's just a brown acrylic wash that I've made. I've got a washes video that gives the recipe. Still not there. You can see how much bigger the cracks are looking now as everything's dried out. And that black shiny from the PVA, which I was told to put on, Yeah. So, plan C or D at this point, I got out some pigments. I'd always planned to use them. And these are two MIG Productions pigments, Vietnam Earth and Light Rust. Perfect colours. I put them over the top and then I hit at just putting loads of them down the cracks. So I filled in all those cracks as much as I could to make sure that the glossy black didn't show. The light rust colour was much more yellow, so I didn't put that much on, but I put some on the surface just for variety. I didn't want this to look plain and boring. You can see there's a skull and vulture kind of appeared on the tree in the background. I'll talk about those in a minute. But first, I needed to glue all of this in place. So once I was happy and I titivated it and got it looking just how I wanted, I misted it with isopropyl alcohol and water. This is about 1/3 isopropyl alcohol, and that just lets everything run properly so the glue will sink in. Once I put that coat on, I sprayed it with a coat of dilute matte Mod Podge. Now this is probably about 1/6 matte Mod Podge to 5/6 water, and I also have the same amount dilution in this dropper bottle, which was just easier to get into all those cracks. Once I was sure that I'd filled all the cracks, I mopped up any excess with a kitchen towel and left it to dry. This giant vulture is going to add some much needed life to the diorama. I printed him many times the size of the mini spaceman so that he would dominate him, but he's also going to be slightly off to the edge so you won't see him straight away. I cleaned him up and then decided he's on some kind of arm instead of a branch, and I dremeled it away. I could have done this with the 3D pile, it probably would have been quicker, but if you're going to Dremel like this, you need to wear a mask. This dust is probably lethal. I left quite a lot on in hindsight, but I didn't want to snap the feet off. They seemed quite delicate. So I carried on dremeling till I had something I could put over a branch. I cleaned him up with just some water, left him to dry, and then primed him with Tamiya spray primer in grey. I find this highlights the areas where there may be some supports nubs still there, so I clean those off. They're hard to see on clear resin. Then I just use some Vallejo colours to paint him. I started off with this base coat of burnt umber. I thinned it so that it wouldn't leave any brush strokes and covered the whole thing, before moving on to a mix of beige brown and yellow ochre. Mostly yellow ochre, as you can see. Now, I'm not a miniature painter, so I drew on a representation of the sort of feather pattern. It did get better by the end, and my second half is definitely much better than my first half, but I paid attention to the photos and the direction that it would move, before moving on to some black grey for the beak and the areas around the beak that just don't seem to have any feathers and are quite dark. Looking at the feathers, I felt they were a bit stark, so I went over with the diluted coat of the lighter colour just to try and mix the two together. And then it was time to look at the white ruffles around the edge. I did those with just pale white, really. I made it so translucent the colours show through from underneath, adding some definition. And then I decided I'd go everything just needed tying together still, so I just used this wash. It's a mid-brown wash to try and add a bit of gleam to the browns, and I used a strong tone on the beak to try and give a little bit more shine in those areas. And then it was time to glue him in place. I just used super glue and zapper and put him on one of the back branches. I liked the view he had. He sort of peered around the tree and under a broken branch to look where the mini spaceman will be, and his view is more or less lined up with it. This woolly mammoth skull ticked all the boxes. It looks slightly alien. It's got those beautiful curving tusks, and it will just fill that corner really nicely at the base of the tree. I cleaned it up with files just like I did with the vulture, and spray painted it with some primer before cleaning it a little bit more. When I was done, it was time for a paint job. The first coat was dilute dark sand, dilute so I don't leave any brush marks in the paint, and then just everything was covered with it. Took a little while to get into all the nooks and crannies, but it'll be worth it. I used ice yellow to paint the top of the skull. I put some neat on some of the highest points and then diluted it and filled in the edges, sort of blending roughly until the whole skull had a sort of variegation from light on the top to dark underneath. Then I mixed in some white to my ice yellow, so I had an even paler colour. I waited for the first coats to dry before doing this, took all the paint off the brush and dry brushed the texture in my skull. This gives a lovely detail to it, otherwise you end up with quite a plain, sort of dull looking skull. This just enabled me to add some light and texture to all the tips and upper surfaces. I added even more emphasis to the tips with the same paint stippled on to give a nice texture. The final layer was a wash. I diluted it slightly and just brushed it all over, and it added another layer of detail to the skull. I used white glue just to secure him in place at the base of the tree, as if he'd got to some shade and pegged it there. A final coat of those pigments just to show that he was part of the landscape and he was done and in place. Now I'm doing 3 mini spaceman videos over time, and I don't want to make this too boring by repeating everything that I said in the last video on how I do a mini spaceman. Very simply put, I cleaned up any excess flash with either a knife or a file. This one didn't need any filling, he just needed a little bit of cleaning. So it wasn't long before I was picking out his arms and gluing them on. This mini spaceman ended up with one arm waving and one arm pointing. As he doesn't appear to have noticed the vulture off to the side, I presume it's me he's waving at as I look at him. Anyway, I filled the arms and then filed them flat and was able to move on to painting. The primer was grey, Tamiya, and then I used white over the top with a bit of black grey to add the layers. Don't look at this gloss black, it so didn't work. I had to come back at the end and sort it. So this is loads and loads of thin layers of white. I would recommend if you're painting a white spaceman, you start with a white primer. It would save you 5 coats. Then I just painted his lower areas and shadowed areas in pale grey, mixing in more and more white as I built up the layers. At this point, having done all of these layers, I felt he looked a bit muddy. I used matte varnish and the white paint to create a glaze, and I painted this over the top of everything just to brighten everything up and also to get rid of some of the brush strokes and to add a little bit more evenness to him. He is white and he is standing in the middle of a desert. He is not going to be too shadowed. I used Tamiya gloss black to just repaint those visors that hadn't worked with the first type of paint that I'd used. And I like this, it dries to a nice shiny high gloss. Now this poor spaceman has been walking for days across this desert, and that needs to interact with his spacesuit. Looks a bit pristine. So I used flesh wash because it's about the right colour, and I stained the bottom of his spacesuit with colour just so that he wasn't pure white. I used it in all the shadowed areas and the underneaths as if dust and light were bouncing back up at him. I have to say he starts looking quite grubby, and then I used the actual pigments diluted with just some water, and I painted those on like a paint. They create a beautiful chalky paint, and they're going to tie in perfectly with the landscape because they're the same colour. So I put those on his boots, painted some flesh wash on his visor, which I've got to say was a little underwhelming, and then added some Tamiya clear to get that shine back on. I fixed him in place with some tacky wax. I like it because he's repositionable. Before tidying up the black edge, it's just plain matte black masonry paint. One pot this size will last you every diorama you will ever create. And then it was just time to admire him. He keeps pointing at me. So this is my little mini spaceman, and he does look alone in this desolate landscape. I've wanted to do a desert for ages. This one came out really well, and those cracks, well, they're certainly a problem for his little legs. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, support me. You can buy a sweatshirt or t-shirt, go over to my website, check out the materials I've used, or pop over to Patreon and support me. Thanks for watching. Remember, subscribe, hit the bell button. See you next time.